Hello and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'm going to be doing an updated crossbreeding guide. My last crossbreeding guide was posted nearly a year ago and there's been a few changes as well as new techniques that I'm using, so I thought it was about time that I made an updated one. If you want to learn how to actually farm, I would recommend you go check out my video, the latest farming guide, which will be in the description. That video will show you how to actually farm in Rust. This video is only tailored towards how to crossbreed. And just quickly before we get into the rest of the video, I want to say a huge thank you to today's sponsor of the video, which is Opera GX. For those unaware, Opera GX is the latest and greatest gaming browser. Of course, if you're watching my videos, then there's a good chance that you're going to benefit specifically from a gaming browser. The reason is because it has a whole bunch of features including limiting your memory and CPU whilst you're playing games. That means that you can keep your tabs open even whilst you're in game. This is extremely important for people who have multiple monitors and like to have other information on the side, and it's especially important in Rust when you need all the RAM you can get. My other favorite features are all the integrations it has. For example, with Twitch, you can log in and watch videos and then pop them out while still on the browser. I also really like the quick access to Spotify and Facebook Messenger. Another really good feature is the catch up on new games as well as discounts. So if you're someone who likes to play the latest games or you're a bargain hunter, then this feature is going to be really helpful for you guys. There's heaps of other extensions and ways that you can customize your browser to your liking, and so that's why I'm very happy to promote this product because it's one that I enjoy personally using. If you want to download it, go to opera.com/gx or click the link in the description. Thank you very much to Opera GX for sponsoring this video, and with all that being said, let's get back into crossbreeding. To start off, I'll quickly go over the genes and what they do. So there's 5 different types of genes, 3 of them are good and 2 are bad. G increases growth rate, Y increases yield, and also for every 2 Y genes you have, you get an extra clone when you clone that plant. H increases hardiness, so this is good in the snow. However, because we have heaters, H gene is essentially useless. The X gene doesn't do anything, but it's a waste of a gene slot, so you don't want to have that. And W increases the amount of water that the plant consumes, so obviously you don't want that either. Ideally, you want a combination of G and Y. For every single plant, the best combination is a triple G, triple Y. However, arguably 4Y, 2G is slightly better just because you don't have to do as much work, so that extra time you save could be spent gathering other things. Either of these is really fine in my opinion. Okay, so now that you know what plant you want, I'm going to explain how crossbreeding works mathematically speaking. When a plant enters crossbreeding stage, which is generally speaking roughly 20 minutes into its growth cycle, it will extract the genes from its neighbors. This means that you can always calculate what the final gene output will be by adding up the sum of genes of its neighbors. The only time the central plant's genes will get counted is when no crossbreeding for that column occurs, which is very, very rare. So when you're counting your genes, you only want to be counting the genes of the neighbors and ensuring that you have a double up in every single column, and then you won't have to worry about what the central plant's genes are anyway. Every single gene has its own individual weighting. All of the green genes weigh 0.6 and all of the red genes weigh 1.0. When doing the maths, you need to look at each one of the columns in order to determine which individual gene has the highest weighting. The one with the highest weighting will be the final gene. For example, if these 2 genes were the neighboring genes, we can determine what the final genes will be for the central plant. If we look in the first column, each G weighs 0.6, so the weighting for G is 1.2, and as there are no other genes in this column, we can safely say that the final result will be a G. The same thing occurs in the second column, so we know that it's going to be a G, and in the third column, we can see that the Y weighs 0.6, whereas the X weighs 1.0. 1.0 is higher than 0.6, so it's going to be an X. The exact same thing occurs in the fourth column and the fifth column. In the final column, H weighs 0.6, and because there's 2 of them, the final weighting will be 1.2, and so it's going to be an H. You can have up to 8 different plants when you're crossbreeding, so as you add more plants, the math can get a little bit more complicated. However, the procedure is pretty standard, and if you follow my formulas, you should be fine. Let's say that we add these 2 extra plants here. We can do the exact same method in order to figure out what's going to be the gene of each individual column. If we look at the first column, we can see that the G weighs 1.2, as there's 2 of them, but there's 2 W's, so that weighs 2.0. 2.0 is greater than 1.2, so it's going to be a W. In the second column, we can see that the G's weigh 1.2, Y weighs 0.6, and X weighs 1.0, so obviously the G is the highest weighting here. In the third column, we have a double Y, which is 1.2, and 1.2 is the highest, so it's going to be a Y. In the fourth column, the W weighs 1.0, which is the highest out of all the other genes. In the fifth column, we see we have an X, which weighs 1.0, but the double H weighs 1.2, and it's greater than the X. In the final column, we can see we have a double H, which weighs 1.2, and it's therefore greater than the X and the Y. I recommend that you get good at the math so that you can do it in your head, as this will save you time when you're picking your genes. However, if you're still learning, you can go and use a calculator. There's heaps of them out there, so I won't give preference to any one in particular, but if you just Google Rust crossbreeding calculator, you'll see a whole bunch of links which will take you to them. On the crossbreeding calculators, all you have to do is enter your genes and it'll spit out the result. With all seeds except for hemp, you can duplicate the seeds by planting them. For example, with a berry, you can plant the berry seed, and then once it gets to ripe, you can harvest it, eat the berries, and you'll essentially be duplicating the amount of seeds you have. This is extremely important because crossbreeding typically takes anywhere from 50 to 100 seeds, depending on your skill and your luck. Unfortunately, however, with hemp seeds, the only way to acquire them is to get naturally spawning hemp. So that means you'll have to pick up at least 50 hemp bushes. Then once you've got a bunch of seeds, plant them all out. The more options you have, the easier it will be to crossbreed. Then give it a couple of minutes till they're all at sapling stage so you can start to clone them. You're going to want to clone the plants that have a minimum amount of red genes. For example, this plant only has one red gene, so I'll pick it up. Something that's important to keep in mind is you never want to have a double X or a double W. This is because to counter out 2 reds, you're going to need 4 greens, which is really difficult to do. So notice how this plant has an X in the 4th column. This means that if I ever see a plant that looks pretty good, however it has a red X in the 4th column, then I'm not going to be able to use it. And the only time I would ever use that plant is if I was to swap it out. So what I'm going to continue to do is run around picking up plants which have a minimal amount of red genes. What we're trying to do is create a double G or Y in each column whilst avoiding double reds. If you click rapidly between the 2 clones, you can see what the doubles are because they won't change. This clone here is quite good because it only has 1 red. However, if you notice it has a red X in the 1st column, one of the clones we're using already has a red X in the 1st column, so we definitely can't use both of these clones together. I'll put it to the side just in case I want to use one over the other, but it's important to keep in mind that we're never going to use both of these. I then continue this procedure, picking up all the clones which have a lot of greens and very few reds, making sure that I never pick up another clone which has a W or an X in the same column as one of my previous ones. And eventually I'm left with 5 different clones, all of which have no double X's or W's in the same column. Here's what it looks like on paint. So now we can go through each one of the columns and add up all the genes to confirm that we have what we want. Remember that genes only interact with other genes in the same column, so you want to separate them like this. If we look at the first column, we can see that we have 2 Ys, which creates a weighting of 1.2. The H creates a weighting of 0.6, as does the G, so we can count them out. The X creates a weighting of 1.0, which is close to 1.2, but it's still less. Therefore, the ultimate result would be a Y, because 1.2 is the highest weighting. A similar thing happens in the next column, as we can see a double G creates a 1.2, which is greater than all of the other weightings. In the 3rd column, something interesting happens. We have a double G and we have a double Y. This means that the double Y will be 1.2 and the double G will also be 1.2. Because the 2 weightings are identical, this means that we'll have a 50% chance to get either a G or a Y. In the 4th column, we have a double Y, which again is a 1.2 weighting. The G is only 0.6, so it's not counted, as well as the W and X aren't counted either because they're only 1.0. In the 5th column, again, we have a double G and a double Y, so again, we have a 50% chance of either of them occurring. In the final column, we have 3 H's, which add up to a total weighting of 1.8. The bottom 2 are 1.2 plus 0.6. 1.8 weighting is higher than the W and it's higher than the X. Therefore, the final column will be an H. As you can see, we now have 4 possible combinations of plants where we have a Y and a G in the first 2 columns. The 3rd column can be either a G or a Y. The 4th is a Y. The 5th can be either a G or a Y, and the final plant is an H. Regardless if we get a G or a Y, we have now created a plant which is only green. On to actually crossbreeding in-game, you want to take a random seed or clone. This doesn't matter which one it is because it's not going to get counted in the final sum of plants, and plant it in the center of your planter box. The reason it doesn't matter is because as long as you have double ups in all of the other columns, then it's going to swap all of its genetics over anyway. You want to plant this central seed in the middle and wait, give it about 5 to 10 minutes just so that it has a head start on all of the other plants. Usually I wait until it's in sapling stage like so, and then I'll plant one of each of the other clones that we were calculating with earlier. It doesn't matter where you place it, any order will do. We counted up 5, so we're going to be using 5 clones in this specific example. Then you'd have to wait another 15 to 10 minutes until the central plant reaches crossbreeding stage. It's important that this one reaches crossbreeding stage first, that's why we gave it the head start. As you can see, just like we calculated, we got one of the expected results. Of course, this plant isn't perfect, so to perfect it, we're going to be using the 50-50 technique. This technique will only work for all green plants. That's why we created one earlier, or if you're lucky, you can just find one. Once you've got your near perfect plant, which is all green, you're going to figure out which genetics you want to change. In most instances, it's going to be changing an H over to a G or a Y. In this example, we have an H in the 6th column, so we're going to want to change that over to a G. For this to work, you're going to need to find two other plants which have a G in the 6th column. However, you cannot have any other double ups in the columns 1 through to 5. For example, if we had 5 X's in the first plant and then we had 5 W's, you can see that if we did all the counting, you'd still be left with your same original plant, but now you have a 50% chance to swap the H over for a G. Of course, you can keep cloning and repeating this so that eventually you will always get the plant that you want. However, if we were to take it back and say, for example, we had a W in the 5th column for both of these plants, you can see that the W would weigh 2.0 and it would outweigh the double Y in column 5. This means that we would get stuck with a W for our last plant. That's why it's absolutely vital that you don't have any double ups in the 3rd and 4th plant. That's why it's also important whilst you're still crossbreeding not to throw away any of your old clones or to harvest the ones that are still growing. This is because now I can go back and look at all those clones that I might not have picked up earlier and find if any of them have a G in the last slot. This is exactly what I did, and I ran around, picked up some extra clones, and I found these two clones. As you can see, they both have a G in the last slot, and the only other double up they have is in the 5th slot, which is another G. Now, normally this would be a bad thing because we only want to have one double up at a time. However, for our current plant, if we wanted to convert it into a triple G, triple Y, we'd need to swap over 2 Gs. So doing this is essentially doing the 50-50 technique, but twice in one go. Now, normally I say to avoid doing double 50-50s, which is to change 2 genes in one go, because it can create some complications, which I will explain at the very end of the video because of some weird occurrences. But for this case, it's fine where we have a double G in the 5th and 6th column, therefore we have a 50% chance to swap over those last 2 genes. To do the crossbreeding in-game is pretty much the same as before. Plant a random seed or clone in the center of your planter box, then you want to give it about a 10-minute head start just so that you ensure that this one reaches crossbreeding stage first. Then once the time has passed, you want to plant 2 of the near perfect clone and then 1 of each of the other ones. This should give you a total of 4 clones every time, and the order does not matter. Wait for the entire 20 minutes and the central clone should crossbreed first. You can see in this instance, none of the last 2 genes actually swapped over, which means we just simply got unlucky. You can clone all of the plants and just repeat the experiment again. Eventually you will get it to switch over because it has a 50% chance to do so. That was just the simple version of the 50-50 method technique. A more advanced version is to place 4 of the near perfect clone in the edges as shown here. Again, you want to give them about a 5 to 10 minute head start just so that they reach crossbreeding stage first. Then you're going to take the other 2 clones which have a G at the end and plant them in the opposite corners. So grab your first clone that has a G at the end and plant it in one corner and make sure that that same clone is in the other corner, then switch to the other clone, plant it in one corner, and make sure that that same clone is planted in the other corner. You should be left with 4 of your near perfect clones which are ahead of the other ones, and 2 of each of the other clones which are in opposite corners. After the edge clones have reached crossbreeding stage, they'll have a 50% chance to swap over the genetics. However, this time we have 4 different clones which have a 50% chance to swap over the genetics, which means that in one planter box you've essentially done the experiment 4 times. Of course, you can repeat this multiple times and you can set up multiple planter boxes, making it nearly impossible that you won't swap over the genes at some stage soon. Now, of course, there's other ways to crossbreed. For example, when I made my first all green plant, I could have just been a bit more picky with the genetics and made a triple G, triple Y straight off the bat. However, the reason the 50-50 method is so good, because statistically speaking, it's a lot easier to find clones which will work in a 50-50 environment where they wouldn't work in a guaranteed result. And because I've shown you with this technique here, you can get the expected return 94% of the time per planter box. You'll save yourself a lot more time and a lot more seeds using the 50-50 technique. And of course, if I decided that I would prefer a 4Y2G plant, all I would have to do is take my new near perfect clone and then find 2 other clones which have a Y in one of the slots where there's already a G, and just repeat this experiment exactly the same. I found 2 different clones which have a Y in the 5th slot, So again, I'll plant my 4 near perfect clones, give it about 10 minutes just so that they grow, and then plant the other plants in the opposite corners just like I did previously. Wait about 20 minutes and you'll see that I have a 94% chance that at least one of my clones will swap its G over for a Y in the 5th column. Here's a little bit of information for those looking to learn about 50-50s a little bit more in depth, and why I try to avoid doing double 50-50s in one go where possible. So in this example, you can see we're doing a 50-50 technique, and the only double ups we have in the 3rd and 4th plant are the double H and double Y. Obviously, we're trying to change that last H over for a Y, so ideally we're always going to have a triple Y and then a G in the first 4 columns. However, in the 5th and 6th, we could have a GY, which is what we want ideally, or unfortunately, we could also have an H in the 5th column, or we could have an H in the 6th column. Now, if you looked at all of these outcomes, it would be safe to assume that there's 4 different outcomes, therefore you have a 1 in 4 chance of achieving each outcome. Ideally, we want a GY in column 5, 6, so you'd think we have a 25% chance of getting what we want. However, this isn't the way the game's being coded. When 50-50s occur, one of the plants gets priority, and when it gets priority for all the remaining 50-50s. For example, if the first plant took priority in the 50-50 in column 5, it would mean that G would take priority over H. But this now means that all other 50-50s will be decided with plant 1 as the priority. Therefore, you would be stuck with a G and an H. If the second plant took priority, you would also get a G and an H. If the third plant took priority, then you would get an H in the 5th column, but you'd get a Y in the 6th column. If the 4th plant took priority, the same thing would occur where the 5th column is an H and the last column is a Y. This means that GY never actually occurs, which means that it's impossible to do the 50-50 technique and pull out a 4G 2Y plant from this example. Which is why it's much more simple to just stick with 50-50s where you only have one double up if possible. The only time a double 50-50 is acceptable is when you're happy to swap over both of the new genetics, not just one. And that concludes the end of this video. If you're having trouble with crossbreeding, I highly recommend you go onto a private server or a public build server. The one I'm using right now is Builder Sanctuary, has a bunch of commands and plugins which allows you to crossbreed much quicker without having to set everything up. Crossbreeding is a skill which you won't just learn from watching my videos, you need to go on to build servers and practice it. If you're having trouble, feel free to join my Discord, as there's heaps of people in there who will be happy to help you out with your questions. Just make sure to come in with a question which actually relates to your struggle. A lot of people ask, how do I crossbreed? Well, I've just told you everything you need to know. It's your job now to go onto a server and actually try it out for yourself. And try not to get discouraged when it's difficult. Everyone went through the headbanging activity of learning it in the first place, I myself included, especially because I didn't have any guides to follow. With all that being said, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in the next one.